Good day, economics students. Welcome to another economics lecture video. The purpose of this video is to introduce all principles and concepts related to our study of pure competition. These lectures will be broken down into two sections. This particular lecture will introduce the characteristics of the four market models and pure competition in the short run. There will be another video to follow which examines pure competition in the long run. Chapter objectives. As previously mentioned on the slide before this one, we're going to discuss the characteristics of the four basic market models. One of the major points of interest of any microeconomics class is to discuss how the economy is divided among what we call the four market models: pure competition or perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. So we will examine the characteristics of these four market models and discuss how and why certain industries resemble the market models. We will spend a significant amount of time talking about the conditions for perfect or pure competition. We will definitely discuss how purely competitive firms maximize profit or minimize loss. And as mentioned on the previous slide, this particular video will discuss those questions for the short run, the period of time when the size of our factory or firm is fixed, capital is fixed, and variable inputs such as labor or materials can be varied based on how much we desire to run the factory. So we'll talk about the short run for this video, long run in the next video. We'll talk about marginal cost and supply curve and why they are identical for a competitive firm in a purely competitive market, right? Then we'll talk about things called barriers to entry, enter and exit industries, and that will be more of a focus of the next video as far as long run adjustments. We will briefly discuss this last bullet point here, difference between constant cost, increasing cost, and decreasing cost industries. All right, so the four market models. Notice down bottom here, we have an arrow pointing from left to right, and the arrow diagrams the four types of market models. So on the far left, we have pure or perfect competition. Any market model to the right of that is referred to as imperfect competition: monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. So we are going to discuss the characteristics of these four market models in detail and discuss why and how certain industries fall into these categories. So this is an important slide, the characteristics of the four basic market models. So again, the four market models are pure competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly, and monopoly. Look on the far left, if you would, the characteristics. So we're going to discuss for each of these market models how many firms, the number of firms we would expect to exist in that type of industry, that market model, right? The type of product that will be produced or the type of service that will be produced under that type of market model, right? How much each particular firm has control over price of its product or service, right? The conditions for entry, in other words, is it relatively easy for a new business, a new firm, a new operator to enter the industry, or is it relatively impossible? Is it challenging? We'll talk about what's called non-price competition, which is simply how much advertising we would expect each firm to engage in. And then we'll just give some examples of the type of business we would assume to fall under these market models. Okay, let's start off with the ideal, the paradigm, the utopian view of the world, pure competition, right? So in a purely competitive market, there's a very large number of firms. Our first characteristic, remember to our basic study of supply and demand, we introduced an idea called the invisible hand and the rationing function of prices, and that the general idea that the equilibrium, the price-quantity relationship in the market, was determined by a large number of buyers acting in their own self-interest to maximize utility, and a large number of sellers acting in their self-interest to maximize profit. And the outcome was ultimately determined by the rationing function of prices, and the invisible hand, such that no one seller could control the market. That's the general idea here when we talk about a large number of firms competing in a purely competitive market. Now, what type of product would these firms be selling? This is an important characteristic of the purely competitive industry. Under perfect competition or pure competition, we would look for a homogeneous or standardized product. So bump down to the bottom there, it says example. Something like agriculture, soy, cotton, rice, corn. Those type of industries are dominated by a very large number of firms, and each producer is selling the exact same product. So much so that one rice farmer cannot differentiate or distinguish their product from any of their competitors. So a standardized or homogeneous product. For that reason, because there's many firms and each firm becomes what's called a price taker, we look at the third characteristic. We're going to discover that one firm operating in a purely competitive market has no control over price. So it says control over price, none, right? No control. We will examine that and discuss that and explain that using some graphical expression over the next few moments of this video on future slides just around the corner. But it's important to understand that each firm has absolutely positively no control over price. They're what we call a price taker. Now, in a purely competitive market situation, there are no what we call barriers to entry. In other words, if ABC company wants to become a rice farmer, if We Love Cotton wants to open up a business and say, all right, now we're a farm, we're growing cotton, it's relatively easy to become a firm, a player, a business in that industry. All you would need to do is buy some property, make sure you're educated on the skills of planting, harvesting crops, and cultivating the crops in between the plant and harvest, and of course take care of any legal paperwork that needs to be in place for the state, local, or maybe federal rules and regulations. But it's easy for a new firm to enter the industry. There's no what we call barriers to entry. There's nothing preventing a firm from starting a business in that industry. So here's another interesting aspect of a purely competitive market. Because there's many firms, because each firm is producing what's called a standardized product, because each firm has absolutely positively no control over price, there will be no need to, and therefore no use of, non-price competition, aka advertising. So when you say, okay, how much advertising will each business, each firm undertake? They'll undertake none. All right, now think about that. It makes sense. If I'm producing cotton and I have a farm and it's 25 acres, why would I advertise my cotton as somehow superior or better to the cotton being grown in the 10 farms around my specific geographic location? In other words, my yield, my product is the exact same as my competitors. There's no need to, and it would be foolish to advertise. Let's skip all the way to the right and discuss the opposite of pure competition, that is pure monopoly, right? So instead of having a large number of firms, our first characteristic, a pure monopoly is the opposite. One firm, one producer, one business is the entire industry. Now the type of product that this firm is producing is important, because how can one firm dominate the entire industry? Okay, they're producing a product or providing a service for which there is significant demand and there are no close substitutes. Something that people need or want, and there's no close substitutes. If that's the case, one firm dominates the industry. When we talk about the next characteristic, control over price, this firm's going to have considerable control over price, right? So the one firm industry, the monopolist, has serious pricing power. And the reason is simple, right? Look at the next characteristic, conditions of entry. It's blocked. It's almost impossible for another business to enter this industry. Think about the diamond industry and De Beers. For the better part of over half a century, De Beers owned something like 88% of the world's diamond resources, right? Alcoa at one point owned something like, 90% of the world's bauxite, which is used to make aluminum, right? AT&T had a virtual monopoly on long-distance phone calls. So it was almost impossible for new firms to enter this industry and compete. Right? And the idea of conditions of entry, blocked. When we cover monopoly, we will discuss in much more detail some more barriers to entry which prevent new firms from entering the industry. So, would the monopolist advertise? It's a good question. Would they engage in what's called non-price competition? There's two reasons why a monopolist would advertise. Number one, they might actually increase demand for their product or service by reminding potential customers of the features of their particular product or service. So for instance, years ago, AT&T would advertise just to encourage people to use the phone a bit more. Hey, it's a good day to grab your phone, call grandmom, and say hello if you haven't talked to her in a while. The other reason a monopolist may advertise is just to be viewed as the benevolent monopolist. In other words, sort of like some goodwill, right? So they're not viewed as the evil empire, right? Now, the example of monopolist down here says most public utilities, so your water company, your gas company, right, your electric company. The only thing I would add to this, those companies are what we call regulated monopolies. In other words, the government has granted those companies the legal right to sell you that product or service, and therefore they have monopoly power, but they also have to answer to a regulatory board when it comes to price changes for whatever they're selling you, water, electric, natural gas. In our lifetime, Microsoft had a virtual monopoly on operating systems. Between, say, 1987 and 2003, Microsoft operating system was the go-to computer system in 94% of the world's personal and business computers. So for that reason, they were the monopolist in the computer software industry, not only for operating systems, but for Office Suite as well. Right, it's a good thing to talk about Microsoft now because we'll reinvestigate Microsoft later, and we'll talk about one of the key features of monopolists, that typically their power is not forever. Okay, the other two market models, monopolistic competition and oligopoly. Let's talk about oligopoly first, and then we'll talk about monopolistic competition. So oligopoly, it sounds a little bit like monopoly, right? Which means what? You're going to have an industry dominated by a few big players. Maybe 6, maybe 8, no more than 10, 14 firms. The automobile industry is a good example of an oligopoly, right? Or when you think about household appliances, there's only 6 or 8 firms that sell household appliances. So when you talk about the next characteristic, the type of product, it's really interesting when you discuss the oligopoly market model, because an oligopolist could be producing what's called a standardized product, or could be producing a product that's differentiated. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay, let's talk about differentiated first. Whirlpool, Frigidaire, Samsung, LG. They all sell washing machines. They all attempt to convince their customers that their product has specific offerings which are superior to their competitors, whatever that feature might be. You can check with an app on your phone how much time is left on your wash, so you can run out and maybe do something real quick in your yard and know that you can run down and switch out to the dryer. Or maybe your washing machine knows when to order more detergent, right? Or just the simple idea that the washing machine just does a better job at washing the clothes, right? So that's the example of an industry with a differentiated product. But oligopoly could be a local oligopoly if you think of something like ready-mix concrete. Now, there's literally thousands of concrete companies across the United States. However, if you look at one specific market geographically, such as the Philadelphia region, even Philadelphia is a large place, even Northeast Philly, there might be only 4 ready-mix concrete companies, because if you buy a truck to deliver the concrete and the concrete is in that truck longer than, say, 35-40 minutes and it hardens, it's useless. So those 4 companies are providing a relatively standardized product, right? Concrete is concrete is concrete. Now, I know that there's different levels of viscosity for concrete, based on the application, but you get the idea. In that case, it's an oligopoly, but they're producing what's called a standardized product. Now, here's the most interesting aspect of the oligopoly. Some of you may have read the book or seen the movie Beautiful Mind, with the economist John Nash. He introduced to economic thinking what's called game theory, which we will talk about in much more detail when we study oligopoly. But when you talk about the idea of control over price and one firm competing against a few other big rivals, what tends to happen is this. The firm needs to consider not only how their customers will react to any change in price or potential change in price, they also need to consider how their competitors will react. Economists call that mutual interdependence. In other words, if there's only 6 firms in the industry, right, and I'm one of the firms, if I raise my price, will my competitors follow suit? Will they stay where they are? Could they lower price? Would my customers be loyal to my price increase, even though they have other options? So we call that idea mutual interdependence, and we will investigate the specifics of oligopoly using game theory in much more detail when we cover this chapter. All right, now conditions of entry. If you think about this logically, why is the industry, why is the market model dominated by a few big firms? It's because there are significant barriers to entry, somewhat similar to monopolists. A firm operating in an oligopoly typically has grown large enough to compete against its competitors. We call that economies of scale. So it might be difficult for a new firm to enter that industry based on the principle that they would have to be enormous, large, huge to begin with to achieve a long-run average total cost low enough to compete against the other 5 or 6 firms. So there's typically significant barriers to entry for a new firm entering an industry dominated by a few big players, right? Now, with advertising and how much advertising will take place, non-price competition, we would expect a significant amount of non-price competition or advertising in an industry that resembles an oligopoly. That market model is going to be distinguished by a large number of advertising by each firm. Let's think about why. Okay, Coke versus Pepsi, right? They only have one competitor, but they have to keep their name and their idea relevant. They have to keep convincing their customers our product's superior to our competitors, and maybe try to sway some of their competitors' customers to start using their product, right? Finally, the example, something I already mentioned, automobile will be an example of an oligopoly that is not standardized, it's differentiated. Ready-mix concrete is a standardized monopoly, right? Or oligopoly, one bad, sorry. Okay, last one, monopolistic competition. Monopolistic competition, this is an interesting one because this tends to resemble a large percentage of the economy. Look at the term monopolistic competition. So on the right, you have the idea of competition, right? On the left, you have monopoly. So you're combining some of the idea of competition and some of the idea of monopoly, and you get monopolistic competition. So what does the industry look like? Okay, let's go through the characteristics. First is a large number of firms, so similar to pure competition. But the product is not standardized like pure competition or perfect competition, differentiated. At this point, we should really talk about down bottom the examples. Retail clothing, right? Restaurants. There's literally thousands of these firms. So there's many competitors, lots of firms, but they're each trying to produce a product or provide a service that they believe is slightly better, slightly different than their competitors. Okay? So for that reason, they have some control over price, the third characteristic of the market model. They may be able to charge a bit higher price based on the assumption that they've created a product or provide a service that their customers believe is somehow better than other choices, and therefore they can sway people to spend a little bit more for their product. Think about the way the retail clothing outlets are organized. You have a company like Neiman Marcus, and then you have a company like Walmart. Do they both sell shirts? Of course they do. Do they both sell pants? Yes. But one company has decided to go after the high-end customer in the market, and one, the low to middle income customer in the market. So some pricing power based on characteristics of the product or service that they are offering. Okay. Now, conditions of entry, similar to purely competitive market, right? Similar to pure competition, it's pretty easy to enter this industry. So if you're a firm and you want to get into a restaurant business, hey, just rent a space or buy a space, fill out the licenses, make sure you get through the inspection process, and you can start operating within a couple weeks. You can start a new restaurant in Philly. That's why there's literally thousands of restaurants in every city. So it's relatively easy. There aren't too many barriers to entry. So when you think about conditions of entry, it's not too many hurdles for a firm to potentially jump over to get started in this business. All right. Now, similar to oligopoly, monopolistically competitive markets, this industry is going to be subject to a large amount of advertising. Each firm has to somehow try to keep convincing their potential customers that their brand, their product, their quality, their characteristic is superior to their competitors, and therefore you as a customer should frequent their store. So there's a significant amount of advertising in an industry that resembles monopolistic competition, and each business is going to try to embrace its customers with trademarks or branding within their advertising, right? And I already gave several examples. Make sure you review these important characteristics, because moving forward, we're going to discuss each of these in its own right, and the characteristics help you understand the economics behind why there are different market models. The remainder of this video will focus on the characteristics of a purely competitive market and the economics of perfect competition. So let's discuss the 3 reasons why the purely competitive model, the perfect competition model, is important for our microeconomic study. Number 1, helps analyze industries with characteristics similar to pure competition. So remember, pure competition is the paradigm. It's the model. It's the utopian market model for economic efficiency, full employment, productive efficiency, allocated efficiency. We will discuss the reasons for that later, but if that's the ideal, we can compare, say, okay, this industry is similar or somewhat the same as purely competitive market, right? The next reason, in the previous chapter, we discussed cost structure of the firm. So in the theory of the firm chapter, we looked at things like fixed cost, right? Costs that are not related to the firm's level of output and are unavoidable. Variable cost, costs that are directly related to the firm's level of production. We will look at those ideas and those cost curves, right? Your average fixed cost, your average variable cost, your average total cost, and your marginal cost. And we will apply all of those cost concepts to the purely competitive market model. The last one is important, the idea of, all right, this is the ideal, this is the standard, this is the norm. So we're going to evaluate the real world and discuss the inefficiencies of monopoly, monopolistic competition, and oligopoly based on the assumption that a purely competitive market model is the most efficient standard. Okay, 4 major objectives to analyzing pure competition. The first one, examine demand from the seller's viewpoint. In other words, what if we're one firm and we're competing in a purely competitive industry? Remember, we're producing a standardized product, a homogeneous product. We can't differentiate our product, right? We're just one firm among the many. So assume there's 5,000 growers of soy. We're one farm, right? Our contribution to total market output is negligible. We're going to see that for each individual firm in the market, we're a price taker, and demand is perfectly elastic at the market price. So we're going to talk about examining demand from the seller's viewpoint. Second one, how a competitive producer responds to market price in the short run. This will be another important idea. If we're one firm among the many, we have no control over market price. We will investigate how the firm reacts to changes in prices in the short run. Now remember, in a later video, we will discuss the long run. For this video, we're just discussing what economists refer to as the short run. Number 3, in that later video, we'll talk about the long run adjustments in a competitive industry. All right, so that's also important, but again, this video concentrates basically on the short run, right? And then evaluate the efficiency of competitive industries. We will reinvestigate using the tools of supply and demand, productive efficiency, and allocative efficiency, and discuss why they are important and how, under a purely competitive situation, economists believe that we are able to, by default, achieve productive and allocative efficiency. All right, let's review these characteristics of a purely competitive market and then introduce another couple ideas that are also important to our study of perfect competition. So, 1, there's a very large number of producers, right? Each producer is one among the many. Also understand that each producer's contribution to total market output is roughly the same. So you could have an industry say, okay, well, there's 5,000 firms, but one firm has 90% of the market and the other 4,999 share what's remaining. Well, that's not a purely competitive market, right? So there's a very large number of firms and they share the market relatively equally. Not the exact same, but each firm's contribution to total market output is not altogether enormous. They're producing a standardized product. Agriculture is the best example, but if we were, say, fishing for Alaskan king crabs and there was 100 boats that had licenses to fish for Alaskan king crabs off the coast of the Bering Sea, right, then again, it'd still be a standardized product. Boat A and boat 743 are catching the exact same fish. For the first 2 reasons, we lead to a conclusion in number 3 here. Each firm becomes what's called a price taker. Each firm competing in a purely competitive market has no control over price. No barriers to entry, idea 4 here. We already talked about this, but it's important to reiterate that if a new firm wants to get into the market, no problem just starting up, right? Fill out the license, buy whatever resources necessary to get going, and you're in. Easy to enter, also easy to exit if the market is not altogether profitable. Here's one that we didn't really discuss yet, but we will discuss in detail in the next slide. In a purely competitive market, each firm experiences demand as perfectly elastic and perfectly elastic at the market price. Graphical representation of this idea on the next slide will drive this point home and reinforce the importance of how and why one firm competing against the many in a market that is selling a homogeneous product, each firm becomes a price taker at the market price, right? We will also discuss these ideas: average revenue, total revenue, and marginal revenue. All right, on the left, we have something that you are already familiar with: supply, demand, right? Markets, buyers, downward sloping demand curve, sellers, upward sloping supply curve, right? Remember, large number of buyers, so the market demand, the reddish pinkish curve there, we can assume that there's literally hundreds of thousands of buyers of wheat. Large number of sellers, upward sloping supply curve, there's 5,000 farmers, right? As if led by an invisible hand, the rationing function of prices, we come to equilibrium, a point where at this level of output and pricing, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, right? So remember, equilibrium is only a temporary situation, but for now, that's the price in the market as determined by the buyers attempting to maximize their utility and sellers simultaneously attempting to maximize profit. Let's assume that P, equilibrium P here, let's assume that's $5 per bushel. So the price, $5 per bushel, was determined by the market outcome. But now we're just one firm, okay? We're one farmer, right? We own 50 acres, right? There's 4,999 other farmers. They own roughly the same amount of land that we do. They are producing and selling the exact same product. All right, large number of producers, standardized product. Any institution or individual that wants to start a farm, no barriers to entry. So easy for somebody else to come in and start competing against us, right? So if you're one farmer and you're producing a product which is standardized and you have a large number of competitors and your contribution to total market output is negligible, you become a price taker at the market price. Notice that demand is perfectly elastic at the market price. So for this individual farmer, they can sell as much or as little at the market price as they desire, but have absolutely positively no control over price. If this one farmer attempted to raise price even by 5 cents per bushel, no one would buy from them. Right? This farmer would also be foolish to reduce their price below $5 because they can sell as much as they want at the market price. So this producer, this firm, this one business competing against the many, standardized product, right? Large number of competitors, price taker, that individual firm experiences demand as perfectly elastic at the market price. Now, of course, the market price may change, but what that's going to do is simply going to change the short-run decision for the firm. But again, the individual firm has no control over price. They're a price taker at the market price. So for each firm competing against the many, demand is perfectly elastic at the market price. On the previous slide, we explained how and why a firm competing in a purely competitive market is a price taker. One firm among the many producing a product which is standardized or homogeneous, can't differentiate the product among their competitors, is a price taker at the market price. So for one firm, they experience demand as perfectly elastic at the market price. Remembering that the interaction of the buyers and sellers determine price at equilibrium, just like we learned in the markets chapter. One firm is a price taker. Let's apply some of this understanding a bit further to our analysis of the firm and add some additional economic thinking to our understanding of pure competition and one firm. Okay, so normally when we look at the demand schedule, right, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. But look at this demand schedule. It says firm's demand schedule. Price 131, quantity 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. What we're saying here numerically is the same idea we expressed graphically on the previous slide. Look at the green marginal revenue, aka the demand curve for this firm, right? What are we saying here is that this firm is a price taker in a purely competitive market. They're one firm among the many producing a standardized product. They can sell as much or as little at the market price as they desire, but have no control over price, right? So for this firm, for every unit they wish to sell, they sell it at the market price. That's what we mean by a price taker, aka demand is perfectly elastic at the market price. So if we look at the demand / marginal revenue curve, perfectly elastic horizontal curve, we could also call that the price curve in a purely competitive situation. So price equals demand equals marginal revenue. Also happens to equal average revenue. In other words, if you say this firm sells 3, they'll sell each one at $131 per unit. So, you take the 3 times 131 and average it out, okay? But it's important to identify that triple alignment here in a purely competitive market. Demand equals price equals marginal revenue. So demand for one firm is perfectly elastic at the market price, and the marginal revenue, which is what? The change in total revenue that the firm receives from selling the next unit of output, is also equal to the market price, right? The total revenue curve is easy to graph. It's just price times quantity. It's right, price times quantity. So here you see numerically and graphically the reason why in a purely competitive market, one firm experiences demand is perfectly elastic at the market price, and therefore price equals marginal revenue equals demand. So, 3 production questions. Notice up here the first line says output determination in pure competition in the short run. Remember, short run, period of time when one of our assets, capital, is fixed. Our other resources such as labor or utilities or materials, they're variable. So the size of our plant, the size of our factory, right, the size of our firm is fixed. We can't make our manufacturing facility any larger for the time being. That might be 3 years, it might be 7 years, it might be 10 years, depending on the industry. So if we were talking about heavy manufacturing, such as an automobile industry, it might take 7 to 10 years to build a new factory. For some light manufacturing, such as a clothing industry, it might take only 2 years to build a new factory. But the short run, the period of time when the size of our plant, our capital resource is fixed. Okay, so we're going to talk about 3 questions that the firm must consider as far as their short run production analysis. The first question, should the firm produce? Now this might sound like a dumb question. In other words, is the firm going to sit around and do nothing, or should they actually try to produce goods and services? Now, let's think about the cost structure of a firm. What is the difference between fixed cost and variable cost? Okay, fixed cost, those costs which are unavoidable and do not vary with the firm's level of output. In other words, the cost to pay for your rent or your mortgage payment, the cost to pay for your insurance policy, right? So those type of costs, the fixed cost, are completely unrelated to how many units that the firm produces per hour, per day, per month, right? So fixed costs, unrelated to the firm's level of output and unavoidable. So here's how you answer that question. So the firm should produce if the firm's going to make a profit, right? Or if the firm will suffer a loss less than their fixed cost, right? So the first question, should the firm produce? The answer will be yes, as long as one of the 2 following criteria are being met. If the firm's going to make a profit. So that's sort of the no-brainer. Obviously, we want to go through the whole rigmarole of opening, operating, producing as long as we're making a profit. But we would also want to produce in the short run if the firm is suffering a loss less than their fixed cost. Now, of course, you might be thinking, well, we don't want to lose money. No, of course we don't want to lose money. But assume that the firm's fixed cost is 100. Now, that could be 100,000, 100 million, right? Assume the firm's fixed cost is 100. If you don't open the factory this month, you lose 100. All right. Now, you don't want to lose 100, but would you rather lose 100 or lose 50? So let's assume that the firm, by operating, would lose 50. And that could be 1,000 or a million. You'd much rather lose 50 than you would lose 100. Right? Again, you don't want to lose, but if those were your 2 choices, that gives you a numerical understanding of what we mean by the firm should produce if they're going to make a profit or suffer a loss less than their fixed cost. Now, later on, we're going to see the relationship between price in the market and the firm's average variable cost at what we call Q star. For now, this is a good enough explanation. We will see this graphically and numerically in a few slides. Okay, so let's assume that the firm answers the first question in the affirmative. They do the analysis, they look at the price in the market, they know they're a price taker, and they have determined that by operating they will either make a profit or suffer a loss less than their fixed cost. Then the next question is, all right, what level, what quantity, how many units should the firm produce? Knowing that the firm has no control over price, we can control and determine quantity of output produced. So what quantity should the firm produce? We're going to employ an extremely important idea here, and it's going to be applicable to all 4 market models. It's called the MR equals MC rule. In other words, the firm will choose the profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output by equating marginal revenue, the additional revenue that the firm receives from selling the next unit of output, to marginal cost, which is the cost the firm incurs from producing that next unit of output. As long as the marginal revenue is of selling the next unit is greater than or equal to the marginal cost, it makes sense to produce the next unit. So the MR equals MC rule. Now, there is an approach called the total revenue, total cost approach to determining level of output. We'll talk about that briefly, but the first idea is far more important, the MR, MC, marginal revenue, marginal cost approach to determining profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output in the short run. Okay, last question. All right, so we said yes, we should produce in number one. Number two, we determined how many units we should produce, what quantity will represent profit maximization or loss minimization. The last question, will our production result in economic profit or short run loss? All right, and we'll demonstrate this again numerically and graphically so you can see visually and you can determine with data whether the firm is making a short run profit or suffering a loss less than its fixed cost. Okay, so this is important, big review here, right? So the firm should produce if the difference between total revenue and total cost is profitable, right? In other words, if we're going to make a profit, definitely produce, or if the loss is less than the fixed cost, right? The firm should produce the output which maximizes profit or minimizes loss. Q star, we call this for number two here, quantity of output which will represent profit maximization or loss minimization for the firm. All right, last 2 points. How do we determine profit or short run loss? Well, we take total revenue minus total cost, and that will help us identify profit or loss in the short run. There's another approach we could take per unit. In other words, we could look what price we are selling each unit. We can subtract the average total cost of production at that level of output, and then we can multiply that by the total number of output we produce for the firm, and that's a second approach to determining profit or loss in the short run. Don't worry too much about calculating that at the moment because we will demonstrate this numerically and graphically, and you will see clearly and concisely what we mean by these two approaches to profit or loss identification in the short run, right? So the firm should not produce if it would suffer a loss greater than its fixed cost. So if we say, okay, let's look at the numbers, let's evaluate our cost structure. Geez, if we produce, we're going to suffer a loss less than our fixed cost, then the firm should shut down. So if the firm's fixed costs this month are 100 and it has performed its analysis and determined that by operating they would lose 110, then it's time to shut down in the short run. Okay, 3 cost concepts, distinct contributions in the decision-making process. So the first one, marginal cost. Marginal cost, the MR equals MC rule. So think of it in these terms. Marginal revenue, the additional revenue that the firm receives from selling the next unit of output. Marginal cost, okay, that's the cost incurred by the firm by producing that next unit of output. So the relationship between marginal cost and marginal revenue, marginal cost is extremely important because it helps the firm determine what we're going to call as Q star, the profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output. So assuming that the firm should produce, the marginal revenue, marginal cost relationship will always help the firm determine quantity of output in the short run that will either maximize profit or minimize loss. This rule applies to all 4 market models, not just pure competition. All right, so the second cost concept application here, if we relate price in the market to average total cost, it will help us determine in the short run what is our economic profit, or if we are making or suffering a loss in the short run. So we look at price in the market at our quantity of output that will either maximize profit or minimize loss, and then we compare the price to the average total cost at that level of output, it will help us identify immediately whether the firm is making an economic profit, suffering a short-run loss, or breaking even. All right, the last cost concept, which is also important, is the relationship between price and average variable cost. Average variable cost. So again, this is an important idea because when we relate price to average variable cost at the profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output, it will immediately help us identify and answer the question, should the firm produce in the short run? And the general rule is, as long as price is greater than average variable cost at the intersection of MR equals MC, at the quantity of output which would maximize profit or minimize loss, it makes sense for the firm to produce, because by producing, the firm will either be making a profit or be covering some of its fixed cost, suffering a loss than its total fixed cost. The first approach to answering the question of what level of output should the firm produce is something you may have seen in a high school math class. You simply take total revenue minus total cost, and you identify where the difference between total revenue and total cost is the greatest. To save a bit of time, we've highlighted this level of output for this firm competing in a purely competitive market. If this firm produces 9 units of output, right, it will have a total revenue of 9 quantity times price, 131. Remember, this firm is a price taker, purely competitive market. Demand is perfectly elastic at the market price. It tells you up top that the price is $131. So you get price 131 times quantity 9 gives you your total revenue of $11.79. Right? The firm has fixed cost and the firm has variable cost. If you add the fixed cost and variable cost together at 9 units of output, the firm has a total cost of $880. So to determine profit, you take total revenue, $11.79 minus $880, and that gives you a profit in the short run of $299. Here's a graphical expression of the same idea. Our total revenue curve, price times quantity. We've graphed here our total cost curve on this same exact graph, and then we can identify that the area between these two, this yellow highlighted, or I should say green highlighted area, that represents economic profit for the firm in the short run. And the level of output which maximizes that profit is the quantity where the distance between total revenue and total cost is the greatest, and that's what we call Q star, quantity which maximizes profit in the short run. Now down bottom, you may have done this also in a high school math class where you identify not only the profit maximizing level of output, but the break-even points. In other words, you see where this curve breaks even with the horizontal axis. Now, this is one approach to determining short-run production output decision for the firm. However, economists employ and prefer the marginal revenue, marginal cost curve, cost approach. It has much more application. So even though this total revenue, total cost curve, total revenue, total cost approach to determining profit in the short run, yes, it works. Economists are much more interested and see much more value in the marginal revenue, marginal cost approach to determining short run production decisions for the firm. So let's spend some time then discussing this extremely important rule, right? So MR equals MC. To identify what quantity, what level of output the firm should produce in the short run, we will refer to this as Q star, right? Quantity which will either maximize profit or minimize loss in the short run. The firm will evaluate its marginal revenue data, its marginal cost data, and choose the level of output where marginal revenue is greater than or equal to marginal cost. The firm would never produce quantity of output beyond the point where marginal revenue is greater than marginal cost. If the cost of producing the next unit is greater than the firm would receive in selling that unit, that number of output would never be produced. Okay, so the MR equals MC rule applies. One important distinction though, assuming producing is preferable to shutting down. Okay, so we have a big assumption here. Assume that we've already determined that in the short run this firm should produce. So by producing, we're either going to cover some of our fixed costs or make a profit. The MR equals MC rule will always apply. Last idea here is that in a purely competitive market, price equals marginal cost because MR equals MC. We're going to revisit this later on when we talk about market efficiency in the long run. Okay. Columns 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. The same exact cost data from the previous chapter. These cost ideas should start to become familiar to you, right? Column 1 is simple. How many units the firm is producing. All right, so 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How many units this firm is producing? And this could be per day, it could be per week, okay? So this is the column 1. Column 2, average fixed cost, which is what? The firm's total fixed costs which are unavoidable and not related to output, divided by quantity, and that gives you average fixed cost, right? Average variable cost, where you take the firm's total variable cost divided by quantity of output, and you can calculate the firm's average variable cost. So there's two ways to calculate average total cost. You can either take total cost divided by quantity of output, or you could take column 2 plus column 3, and that will also yield total cost. The all-important row 5, marginal cost. How much does cost change? What's the change in total cost associated with producing the next level of output? So in other words, for this firm, the marginal cost of producing unit 1 is $90. Then marginal costs begin to fall. Marginal cost of producing the second unit of output, $80. Third, $70, and so on down the line. All right? Remembering that the marginal cost curve and the average variable cost curve, as well as the average total cost curve, all reflect that idea of diminishing marginal returns in the short run, right? And the idea is that as we add a variable input, labor, to our fixed resource capital, initially we have a high level of efficiency, but then beyond some point, right, what happens is that we've maximized our efficiency and costs begin to rise. That's because of diminishing marginal returns. All right, column 5, remember, in a purely competitive market, this firm is a price taker, right? So column 5, 131, marginal revenue, that's the price of the market. This firm can sell as many or as little units as they wish. So marginal revenue, change in total revenue the firm receives from producing the next unit of output. Because the firm experiences demand is perfectly elastic at the price in the market, marginal revenue equals price, right? Marginal revenue equals price. The firm, each time they sell an additional unit, they receive $131 in additional marginal revenue. So before we look at column number 7, using the MR equals MC approach to determining profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output, assuming producing is preferable to shutting down, and we will discuss more about that later. Assume producing is preferable to shutting down. What level of output would this firm choose to maximize profits or minimize loss? Okay, let's look at the potential output of 6, 7, and 8, right? At a level of output at 6, the marginal revenue the firm receives from producing the 6th unit is $131. The marginal cost of the 6th unit is only $80. That makes sense. Marginal revenues are greater than marginal cost. At 7 units of output, 7 quantity, marginal revenue is $131, marginal cost $90. Okay, that makes sense. At 8, marginal revenue $131, marginal cost $110. Still good. At 9, marginal revenue $131, marginal cost $130. Excellent. Marginal revenue is still greater than or equal to marginal cost. But look what happens if this firm attempted to produce and sell the 10th unit of output. The marginal cost associated with the 10th unit of output is greater than the marginal revenue. In other words, it would cost the firm more to produce the 10th unit than they could sell that 10th unit for, right? It cost the firm $150 to produce the 10th unit, and they only receive $131 in revenue for selling that unit. Never choose that level of output where marginal revenue is less than marginal cost. Therefore, Q star for this firm is 9. So this firm will choose to produce 9 units of output, and they will receive a profit of $299. Now, how do we calculate that $299? Pay attention closely to the numbers here. I'll go over it twice. There's two possible approaches to calculating the profit for this firm. Think of it on your own for a moment. Okay, we're back. All right, so there's two ways to calculate the profit for this firm. We know the firm sells every unit at $131. The firm is a price taker at $131. Okay, good, great. So what's total revenue for this firm? If they sell 9 times 131, that's total revenue. So you could take 9 times 131, and you could calculate the total revenue for this firm. Now remember, this is exactly the same approach we took on the previous slide, right? Or 2 slides, I should say, previous to this. We used the total revenue, total cost approach. So if you take the total revenue, or I should say if you take 9 and you multiply it by 131, the firm has a total revenue of $1179, right? So there's your total revenue. How could you calculate total cost? Total cost is simple enough. Look at average total cost, column 4, at 9 level of output. So if you took 97.78 and you multiply that by 9, average total cost at 9 units of output, you come out to 880.02. So 1179 minus 880 works out to be $299 in profits. So again, total revenue, total cost approach to determining profit for this firm in the short run. There's another approach. We could use this approach, and some students find this easier. It actually helps them sort of visualize and internalize and understand the idea of Q star, right? Profit maximizing level of output in the short run. All right, let's take per unit profit. Let's use that approach to calculating the firm's short run profit or loss. So this firm is selling each unit at 131. Remember, we're a price taker. Demand is perfectly elastic at 131. So if you say, okay, 131 is the price in the market, so we're selling each unit at 131, and we have an average total cost per unit of $97.78, right? $97.78. Then this firm has a per unit profit of $33.22. So again, per unit profit is simply price, column 6. Remember, price equals marginal revenue in a purely competitive market, right? We're price takers. Price minus average total cost at Q star. Q star is the level of output which maximizes our profit or minimizes our loss, right? So average total cost at 9 units of output per unit is $97.78. So 131 minus $97.78 per unit profit, $33.22. If we multiply that times 9, because we're making 9 of them, so we make $33.22 for each unit, then again, our profit comes out to $299. Now, if you actually do this in a calculator, there's a slight rounding error, just to make you aware of that if you're going through the trouble of following along with a calculator. All right, so we're just rounding to the closest dollar. It's only off by a few cents. All right, graphically, let's talk about this because it's extremely important that you identify these relationships graphically. Okay, so let's assume this was given to you on a quiz, just these two graphs, the marginal revenue graph and the marginal cost curve. All right, you can determine a lot about the economic situation of this industry just by looking at these two graphs. First, if you see a graph where marginal revenue is elastic, in other words, where the marginal revenue curve is perfectly horizontal at the price, you can already automatically determine this is a purely competitive market and that the firm is a price taker, right? So a horizontal marginal revenue curve tells an important detail about the story. Price is perfectly elastic at the market price. This firm is a price taker. They can sell as many or as little as they wish at the market price, have absolutely positively no control over the market. So it's a purely competitive market, easy entrance and exit into the market. Right, no need to advertise, right? So standardized products, all of these great things. The next thing you can determine is that if the firm should produce, the firm should produce 9 units of output. All right, we can see this graphically now where the marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost curve intersect. Right? If we look and say, man, any output level beyond 9, marginal costs are greater than marginal revenue. Any output below 9, and we could still make additional profits by producing and selling more. So if the firm should produce, the firm should choose profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output of 9. Now we look at another important relationship. All right, so we already determined that our cost structure helps us determine Q star by equating MR to MC, marginal revenue, marginal cost. Now, as long as price, 131 in this case, is greater than average variable cost at Q star, it makes sense for this firm to produce. The firm will make a profit or suffer a loss less than its fixed costs. So if you were given just this information on a quiz, you would know two things. Number one, the firm should produce. Number two, the firm should produce 9 units of output. Now, we already know the answer to this, but assume for a moment we didn't. If this was the only information provided, you actually couldn't determine whether or not this firm would make a profit in the short run or suffer a loss. Could be either one. We do know for certain that the firm should produce because price is greater than average variable cost at Q star at 9 units of output. Because price is greater than average variable cost, we know that the firm will at least cover some of its fixed cost and suffer a loss less than its fixed cost if it produces. It may make a profit. Now we bring our average total cost curve into the equation and into the picture. Good news for the firm. In the short run, not only is price above average variable cost, the brownish curve, right? Price is also above average total cost at 9 units of output. Why is that good? Look at our little rectangle here, economic profit. Now, what do I mean little rectangle, right? Remember when you did area of a rectangle when you were in 6th grade, length times width, and you thought, oh, I'll never use this, no practical application to this. Well, actually, there is practical application to this, right? If you take 131 minus 97.78, we already calculated that before, 33, right? 33 and change, 33.22, right? That's the width of your rectangle. And then times that by 9, right? That's the length. There's an area of 299 in this economic profit rectangle. So the difference between price, 131, minus average total cost, right? 97.78 is a width of 33.22. That segment of your rectangle, right, times 9 because we're producing and selling 9 units of output. That represents economic profit of 299. Quick question, important question. If this is a purely competitive market and economic profits persist, what's going to happen? Well, maybe you should review the first part of this idea of what do we mean by economic profit. Economists assume that in a purely competitive market where it's easy for firms to enter and exit, right, that anytime there's economic profits to be had, there's probably going to be new participants in that market very soon. What is economic profit? Remember, the economist measures profit by taking total revenue minus implicit cost and also subtracting out explicit costs, right? Both. So explicit costs are the ones that are easy to identify, the ones that are explicit, the ones you get a bill for, all of your accounting costs. Implicit costs are the cost to attract and maintain the owner's resources. So in the long run, we're going to assume that because firms can enter and exit the industry easily, that this economic profit is actually going to probably shrink and eventually go away. Let's look at the short run loss minimizing case, right? So what's happening here is that through no fault of our own, we're a purely competitive firm operating in a market where there's a standardized product and we're a price taker. Demand is perfectly elastic at the market price. We can produce and sell as much as we wish at the market price, but we have no control over price, right? So there's been a significant decline in demand. The decline in demand has pushed market price down from $131 to $81. So we're price takers at $81 per unit. Demand for our firm is perfectly elastic at the market price of $81. We can sell as much as or as little as we want at that price, right? Our real question is, what quantity should we produce if producing is preferable to shutting down? So price, $81 equals marginal revenue, right? If we're going to sell another unit, we'll sell it at the market price. Price equals marginal revenue equals demand, all right? So let's look at our cost structure. If the firm should produce, Q star, right, profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output will occur at 6. Now, what does that mean, right? Marginal revenue equals marginal cost at 6 units of output. So this firm, any production beyond 6, marginal costs are greater than marginal revenue, right? So this firm would never produce the 7th unit of output. This does not tell us whether or not we should produce. It just tells us if the firm should produce. We've identified the profit maximizing or loss minimizing level of output in the short run. So what's the determining factor on whether or not this firm should produce? As long as price is above average variable cost at Q star, it still makes sense for this firm to produce. So we look at average variable cost at Q star at 6. Average variable cost per unit is $75. You see that on the left, V equals $75. Price is $81. Why is this important information to the firm? This tells us that producing is preferable to shutting down. We will either be making a profit or suffering a loss less than our fixed cost. Remembering that for this firm, the fixed cost was 100. Fixed cost was 100. Now, will the firm make a profit or suffer a loss? It's good news that price is still above average variable cost at 6 units of output. It's bad news that price has fallen below average total cost at this level of output, right? So again, price is above average variable cost, the firm should produce. Price has fallen below average total cost, right? Which means we will suffer a short run loss. How do we calculate the loss? Well, we're selling each unit for $81, right? The average total cost per unit at 6 level of output is $91.67. So if we were to take $91.67 and we subtract $81, so our average total cost per unit minus the price we sell each unit, that means we're suffering a loss of $10.67 per unit. We multiply that by 6, and this firm is suffering a total loss of $64. $64.02 to be exact. All right, so that's bad. Obviously, we don't want to lose money, right? So it's not good to be losing money. But would you rather lose 64 or would you rather lose 100? All right, if you went to the casinos on a Friday night, you don't want to lose, but you'd rather lose 64 than lose 100. If you were operating a farm and you were selling a standardized product like corn or rice or wheat or cotton or soy, maybe this is just one bad year, right? You lose $64,000. Knowing that as long as you stick with it, things will come around, things will improve, right? So you're suffering a loss less than your fixed cost. It makes sense to operate the farm because your loss is less than what would have happened or you would have incurred if you shut down. Now the shutdown case. Again, price has fallen in this market to a new low of $71. Demand continues to decline. If the firm should produce, they would produce where MR equals MC, but unfortunately, price is below average variable cost at this level of output. Average variable cost at 5 is 74, price is 71. If the firm produces, they would actually suffer a loss greater than their fixed cost. This is the shutdown scenario, shutdown case. It makes more sense not to operate and to simply suffer a loss equal to your fixed cost. Common mistake among students. Many times students will think, okay, if we shut down, our loss will be 0. That's not the case. If we shut down, our loss will not be 0. If we shut down, our loss will be equal to our fixed cost, which is 100. Remember, we can't avoid paying the rent. We can't avoid paying for the insurance. So those are costs that are not related to the firm's level of output, right? And they're unavoidable. So if the firm has decided it's preferable to shut down in the short run than to produce, it will suffer a loss equal to its fixed cost. You obviously see here that price is also below average total cost. All right, remember when we studied supply, and we said supply is what? It's the various amounts of a good or a service or a resource that sellers are willing and able to purchase, series of prices, specified amount of time, other things equal. So on the left here we have a series of potential prices, 151, 131, 111, 91, 81, 71, 61. The next column says how much the firm would make available for sale, right? The various amounts of a good or service or resource that producers are willing and able to make available for sale. So this data is telling us, given the price in the market, this firm is willing and able to make available the following amounts for sale. How do they determine that? Well, the firm determines the quantity of output based on the profit maximizing or loss minimizing quantity, Q star in the short run, by equating marginal revenue to marginal cost. So in a purely competitive market, what are we doing here, right? We're seeing like, okay, how do we determine the relationship between price and quantity supplied? On the right hand side, it shows you for this firm that how much profit or loss they will suffer based on the price in the markets. Notice that the loss for the price of 71 and 61 is the same. That is because if the price is $71 or $61, the firm has determined that shutting down is preferable to producing, and therefore will suffer a loss equal to its fixed cost. Let's look at a graphical explanation of the marginal cost and short run supply curve of the firm. So what do we have on this graph? All right. The blue somewhat dotted and somewhat solid curve is your marginal cost curve. The cost the firm incurs from selling the next unit of output. Change in total costs associated with producing the next unit of production, right? Average variable cost, average total cost, brown curve and red curve respectively. Marginal revenue is what? The price in the market. Marginal revenue is the price in the market. Change in total revenue the firm receives from producing the next level of output. Why is marginal revenue equal to price? Because this firm is a price taker. It's a purely competitive market, so they can sell as much or as little at the market price they wish. The firm is a price taker at the market price. Price is perfectly elastic. So here we have a series of potential prices. Price 1, price 2, 3, 4. And what do we see here? It's like, oh, wow. What we've done is we can demonstrate the quantity of output that will maximize the firm's profit and or minimize the firm's loss in the short run based on a series of prices We've also equated the fact that the short run supply of the firm is equal to their marginal cost structure, right? In other words, what is supply? The various amounts of a good or service that producers are willing and able to make available for sale, a series of prices, specified amount of time. This graphical representation helps us visualize the idea that the firm's decision-making profit on what quantity they should supply is simply a reflection of the marginal cost structure of the firm and the prices that could take place in the market based on market conditions. So if we look at the segment of the marginal cost curve, right, at or above the average variable cost curve, that represents the short run supply curve for the firm. Now remember, in a purely competitive market, we assume that all firms are facing the similar cost structure. In other words, their technology of and approach to manufacturing is highly similar. They're all forced to adopt the most competitive, technological advanced approaches to producing this product or service, and therefore competing on the same playing field as far as cost structure. And they're all price takers because they're each of their contribution to total market output is minimal, right? So what we could do is we could generalize and say that this represents one firm, but it would also reflect the habits of all firms operating in a purely competitive market, and therefore we make this important distinction that for all pieces of the marginal cost curve, the segment of the marginal cost curve above the average variable cost, it demonstrates the level of output that will take place for the firm, knowing that if price were to fall below average variable cost, this firm would, in the short run, decide shutting down is preferable to producing. What about point D versus point E on this particular graph, right? What's going on at D versus E? At E, the firm would be making what? Economic profit. At D, the firm would be breaking even, normal profit, right? Now think about this for a moment because we're going to revisit this idea when we talk about dynamic adjustments in purely competitive markets in the long run, right? Why would we expect that over longer periods, the picture is going to resemble the point D on this curve, where firms aren't making economic profits and are not suffering economic losses? Something for you to ponder as we move forward into our next videos about long-run dynamic adjustments in purely competitive markets, and then a reevaluation of economic efficiency in competitive markets.